Hello and welcome back to part 3 of doing Peter Gabriel Genesis. Today I'm going to be talking about Nursery Cryme, the 1971 album in which we finally get the Genesis lineup that will take us through to the end of the Gabriel era. In the transition from Trespass to this album, Anthony Phillips left the band, I believe due to stage fright. And the drummer from that album was let go, I believe primarily because there was some feeling he was not quite on the level that they were looking for. And as their replacements, you have Steve Hackett on lead guitar and Phil Collins on the drums, both of whom are musicians who one immediately associates with Genesis. You know, Steve Hackett's guitar sound and the way it nestles into Genesis' overall sound is something that will be with them through the rest of the 70s, even after he leaves, because they never quite figured out how to replace him in the 70s, but I'll get to that eventually. And Phil Collins, of course, you know, when you think of Genesis, you think of Phil Collins. To a lot of people, far more than Peter Gabriel. And he defines Genesis for the rest of their career. Attempt at replacing him after he left in '96 notwithstanding. Not being a musician myself, I am not entirely qualified to say what it is they bring to the table. Other than that, the drumming is a huge thing. The drumming on Trespass is good, but it's very standard 70s rock drumming. Whereas Phil Collins has a different touch, he has a different feel, he has a much more skillful and unique approach on these classic Genesis albums than any of their previous drummers, or any of their drummers afterwards. You know, there's some great drummers playing on Calling All Stations, but they are not doing anything interesting. And I think it's important that both Hackett and Collins are kind of off the beaten path from general, you know, sort of stereotypical prog guitarists and drummers, because they made certain other choices around this time that, you know, sort of very much put them closer to, you know, sort of what was becoming standard for progressive rock. You know, there's more Mellotron. Yeah, I think they actually bought one from King Crimson. You know, they were very interested in sort of joining into that scene, you know, which is apparent on Trespass, but it's much more apparent here. And I think both Hackett and Collins really play a role. Hackett in particular, this album feels like a showcase for Steve Hackett at a lot of times, in a way that none of the other albums he did with Genesis do, which is interesting because I think quite a bit of this material was actually written before he was in the band. And those of you who are familiar with the history of Genesis will know that, you know, throughout the years, you know, Hackett was not entirely happy with the amount he was allowed to contribute to Genesis albums. It's just ultimately the main reason why he left. And speaking of which, that's the last big thing to talk about with this album, is that it inaugurates the sort of Rutherford-Banks writing partnership that will define the entire duration of Genesis. And it's interesting because it's a major shift from Trespass to this album that I didn't even realize was a shift for the longest time. I think I told the story in the Trespass videos. Anyway, I've wasted enough of your time, so let's talk about the individual tracks of this classic album. The record opens up with a massive 10-plus minute epic, The Musical Box, a gothic Victorian ghost story about a little boy who comes back as a ghost after having his head knocked off by a croquet mallet. Their lyrics are really good. They're very Freudian, and they get a little bit weird in a way that I suspect would probably not fly today, but that works within the context of the horror story being told in said lyrics. Both Hackett guitars and Banks key solos are on full display here. There are 3 sort of main bits: the opening bit, solo section, Old King Cole bit in the middle, and then another bunch of solos, and then the ending thing at the very end. And it ends with this massive epic flourish, and it's a great, great, great song. Probably the best thing Genesis had done to date. And if I were going to rank the sort of the epic Genesis tracks, I would say this is a very solid number 2 or 3. For Absent Friends is a pleasant acoustic thing about 2 elderly people going to pray for either their deceased spouses or their deceased friends. And it's sung by Phil Collins, who is a little bit tentative here, as he would be on basically every Genesis album he sang on in the 70s, but the strength of his voice is still on display. A major part of this era of the band will come to be Gabriel and Collins harmonizing. And it's interesting because I believe it was in the 2007 sort of mini documentary thing they did for those remasters. Gabriel pointed out that on a lot of these albums, in the original mixes, you can actually hear Collins as much or more than you can hear Gabriel. So track 3 is, for me, the other major highlight of this album, the return of the giant Hogweed, featuring some great Hackett guitar tapping, Gabriel flutes, and I think this might overall be the most aggressive Genesis song. It's either this or The Knife. I remember joking to one of my metalhead friends when I was first getting into the group that this track was Genesis inventing Iron Maiden. And you know, having really heavily listened to Iron Maiden and a lot of the other bands that inspired Iron Maiden, I don't really get that now, but it is influential in that department. I've always been fascinated by the lyric. You know, giant Hogweed is of course a horrible plant that, you know, is one of the most toxic things I'm aware of that grows in northerly climates. It's just horrible. I remember when I was a little kid, they found some about a mile from where I lived, and I remember it was this great big thing where foresters, or I presume something like that, had to go in and destroy them because they're hazardous to life. And this song is a tale of, you know, the Hogweed rising up and attacking humanity in one final battle. That's another thing about Peter Gabriel Genesis. You know, everybody assumes that Peter Gabriel Genesis is about, like, fairies in Victorian gardens having tea and, like, you know, going off to the mystic realms of Avalon. But there's actually a lot of, like, science fiction and, like, as we'll see on the next two albums, like, almost like gangster narratives on Peter Gabriel era Genesis albums. If you had asked me what I thought of this album when I first got it when I was in high school, I think I would have told you that it's 3 really good epic tracks with 4 sort of B-sidey things. But I don't really agree with that now, and I especially don't agree with that when it comes to this track, which I think is extremely strong. I'm not really sure what it's about, but it has a very strong vocal performance, very strong playing, very strong songwriting. It's very catchy, despite the fact that it doesn't really have much of a chorus. I especially like the instrumental thing in the middle, which reminds me a lot of the sort of things that they were doing on Trespass. And in fact, a lot of this track feels like it could have been on Trespass. I don't think I like this track quite as much as Seven Stones, but it is very strong. It's one of my favorite shorter Gabriel era songs. It's a character study about the last day or so in the life of a suicidal restaurant owner. It's very half and half. It goes from being very lighthearted to very dark. And it reminds me a lot of the Kinks. It also reminds me a little bit in a way that makes me wonder if they listened to this track of This Sporting Life off of the classic Godley and Cryme album L. Now that I've said that, I'm kind of thinking, you know, I've never actually read anything about this, but I do honestly wonder if Gabriel was a fan of the Kinks and what they were doing in the 60s, because this does remind me a little bit of something that Ray Davies would write. I don't know if 60s Ray Davies would go quite as dark as Gabriel does here, but it seems like something that 70s Ray Davies might have written if he wasn't, like, composing, you know, forgotten sequel rock operas to the Village Green Preservation Society about how communists are going to convert the world into Cybermen or something. Harlequin is one of the other tracks on here that I know people sometimes say is very B-sides-ish, and I do get that, although I have a lot of love for the song. What I like about it is that it honestly reminds me a lot of what I think Trespass would have sounded like if Collins and Hackett were on the album. And so we end the record with a third progressive epic, a very good and atmospheric and evocative take on a very, very, very strange myth. I believe specifically from Ovid's Metamorphosis, the story of Hermaphroditus, the son of Hermes and Aphrodite, who, after being stalked by a nymph, I guess I would say assaulted, and then through divine intervention, forcibly merged into a hermaphroditic being, thus being the origin of the name. Like I said, it's a very atmospheric, very evocative track. They sell the unease of the story, because it's a strange myth. It's probably one of the strangest Greek myths. And they sell it really well. Ending guitar solo has always stood out to me because it's this bizarrely, celebratory, rising to the heavens ending to a track that the narrative of which in a lot of ways reads like a horror story. But I really like it. It kind of feels like a dry run for Supper's Ready in some ways. I also really love the evocative intro, that's the mellotron and the guitar. It's really, really good stuff. I don't know if I would put it up as high as some people do, but it's a really good track. You almost certainly don't need me to tell you this, but Nursery Cryme is a very, very strong album. I do think I would say it's the least of the Hackett and Collins Gabriel era albums, although that's not saying much. 71 to 74, Genesis had one of the strongest runs of any band I can think of in that era. But it is nonetheless true. There is a certain unevenness to some of the material on here. As much as I personally love all of it, that isn't there on Foxtrot or Selling England or The Lamb. And it's honestly not even quite as extreme on Trespass. Trespass has, I would say, 2 slightly more B-sides-ish tracks, but the rest of Trespass is extremely strong. Whereas with this album, even though the shorter tracks are extremely strong, in some ways stronger than the shorter songs on Trespass, I nonetheless think that the extended work is so much stronger that it makes the album a choppier experience than it necessarily should be, and I think that's something that was rectified a lot on the successive Genesis albums. But nonetheless, it is a very, very, very strong album. I would rate this either a high 8 or a low 9. I would think leaning a little bit more towards an 8. 8.7, 8.6, something in that vicinity. Not quite on the level of a 9, but, very, very strong. And if you have never heard any Genesis, I highly recommend that you listen to this album today. Until next time, I will see you all later. Bye.